you could say the dynamics of receiving God's love are fairly simple, couldn't you, in terms of to understand. But what the fear does, or you could say what the lies do, the lies we tell ourselves do, the lies are there to try to make everything more complicated. The more complicated something is, the less inclined we are to do it. So the lies are there to purposefully complicate the process of dealing with things. And the reason why we want to purposefully complicate is to distance ourselves from the grief that we have, yes. Right? So the more we can distance ourselves from our grief, the more we feel like we can control everything, the more we feel like we have power over it all, the more we feel like we are stable, the more we feel like we are clever, the more we feel like we are in control. Right? But from God's perspective, we're becoming more out of control, more stupid, more crazy, more disturbed, more psychotic. It's interesting, isn't it, the contrast between what the world defines as stable, in general, you know, compared to what God defines as stable. The way God sees it is that when you choose to feel your grief, you are being the most stable you can be while having the grief in you. And as soon as you choose to not feel your grief, you become more unstable. Every decision you make to not feel grief makes you more unstable, more out of control, more unloving, more in addiction, more pain, more suffering. Mark?
Is it a matter of us not measuring correctly? Because when you put it like that, it's just like there's a lot of negatives for not
Yeah.
doing that.
We basically are saying that the avoidance of grief is the most important thing in your life.
Yeah.
So you've actually got your priorities wrong. Can you see that? From God's perspective, your priorities are wrong. If avoidance of grief becomes the most important thing in your life, it also becomes the thing that you're making your God. Because it's dictating every part of your behaviour, just like a God would. Right? So you're basically saying the fundamental law of the universe is avoid grief. You're basically setting your law system, your internal law system, and quite a few months ago we talked about our internal law versus God's law. And unless God's law is our internal law, we won't be able to live by God's laws. But our internal law system is basically saying pain and grief, avoid at all costs. Number one. And this avoid at all costs our pain and grief, which has now become our God, dictates every other subsequent behaviour that's out of harmony with truth. So creation of a fear, out of harmony with the truth. Creation of an addiction, out of harmony with truth and love. Creation of anger, creation of denial. These all are creations, human creations, so that we can fundamentally avoid the truth about our grief. And unless we've focused our attention on the truth about our grief is impossible to feel. So you tell yourself lies about your grief, you're not going to feel grief. And that's the purpose of telling yourself lies, so you don't have to feel it. Robert?
So harming another person creates a grief in them. So,
It doesn't have to, does it?
well, no.
No.
Depends on the person, I guess. But
It depends on their state, doesn't it?
yeah.
If
no,
they're prepared to feel their grief straight away,
right.
there would be no lasting harm, will there?
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a
Good
rare
call.
person.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, repentance sort of slots into the same sort of process. That's
Well, this is the process of repentance, isn't it?
right.
The thing mostly that we have to repent for is telling ourselves a whole heap of lies
Yep.
so that we don't have to feel grief.
Yep.
That's cool.
So most of us, they're our biggest sins. Our biggest sins are created by the avoidance of our grief.
Okay, thanks.
Now, can I just say though, it's not the only source of your sins. Remember, Ammon and a man created sin and they didn't have grief. So what was the cause of their sin? Nina?
Thinking they were God and not needing God's love, or not asking for God's love.
Let's be more specific. Angela. And Di next to you.
They wanted to be gods themselves.
Let's be more specific. Di.
Refusing God's love or arrogance in themselves.
I don't think anybody are going to get it. What did we just say
Avoid the
about
grief.
sin? It comes from the avoidance of grief, we said. But what gets created above that grief? What's the thing that gets created there? Jada?
Like they had a desire to create a lie.
That's exactly right. The lie being the one you've already mentioned. The lie that they could be gods themselves. They had a desire to create a lie. You can, as soon as you create lies in your life, sin becomes the natural result. That make sense? So you could say your sin is a result of two things: creating lies about your grief, or you could just say creating lies. Covers all things, doesn't it? And you can create a lie whether you're perfect or imperfect. You can create a lie. When I say perfect or imperfect, I mean the perfect natural man can create a lie. Right? So it's the creation of lies that you come to emotionally believe in, that you come to desire, that is the cause of all suffering, cause of all sin. So if we go back to Rob's thing about repentance, repentance is really about, if we look at it globally, repentance is really repenting for the lies you created. Make sense? If you think about it that way, you'll be pretty accurate, right? Now, of course, it's not just your creation, because there are usually other people around you creating lies too, right? Tristan?
So then is a sin also wanting to believe in someone else's lies that they've created?
Spot on. Spot on. So, as a child, you had no choice but to accept the lies that others created. But as an adult, you have a choice to accept lies or not. Can you see that? You have a choice to stop believing the lies you're told. Right? And all sin is a result of lies. Anything false is what creates sin. And the interesting thing about it that I find so fascinating at times is it is all an emotional process. The desire to lie to yourself is emotional. The desire to cover over your lies with addictions is emotional. The desire to cover over your addictions with denial is the suppression of emotion is emotional. The desire to get angry and upset, which is an emotion, when you don't get your addictions met, is emotional. So it's very interesting that it all comes not from an intellectual state, but from a feeling state. So you could say, if we go back to the question about Amon and a man, they felt the lie was true. They felt that they could be gods. They didn't think it. They felt it. And in fact, thinking it is not necessarily a sin. Because you could have just wondered, is it possible? Is it not possible? That's just a pondering about an event, isn't it? Yep. It's the feeling of it that is the sin. Can you see? By feeling they could become gods, they acted upon the feeling. The feeling was the sin, and then the action taken created more sin. Yep. But they had to feel it first. Now, they might have discussed it initially, but if they had felt properly, if they had been feeling clearly, they would have dismissed it readily, wouldn't they? Yeah. But in choosing to feel that they could, they also chose to feel the lie rather than the truth. And in choosing to feel the lie, they created fear, pain and suffering. Not just for themselves, but for all humanity. And substantially that's what you do when you feel your lies. You create pain and suffering not just for yourself, but all humanity. That's the danger of believing your own lies. Now I know for many of you, not all the lies are your own. You know, some of them were your parents' lies. But as I said, you're now adults, you don't have to believe lies. You don't have to believe in Santa Claus. You gave that up when you were what age? Can you see with the Santa Claus thing, the belief in a magical being who comes from the North Pole delivering presents? Can you see you probably gave that up what? When you were what?
3.
Some of you 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Usually by 10. It's all gone, right? Yeah. Now, it was that easy to give up that lie.
That's right.
Now compare that with giving up the lies, the other lies Mum and Dad taught you. Can you see why it was so easy to give up that lie and not the others? Archie?
Is it because we didn't have as much of a faith in it, and we didn't
It didn't mean
feel
much to
it.
us. Yeah. We didn't feel it. Yeah. Yeah. And our parents probably didn't feel it either, right? You know, they didn't feel it because they knew they were creating a fiction, so they didn't feel it, right? Tristan?
There's also not that much grief to avoid in that, with that life.
Correct. And not a lot of grief to avoid. You know. Can you see some of our childhood false beliefs we gave up? Plonk. Hardly any effort whatsoever. But they were the ones where there was no emotional imperative from our parents to give up or to accept. The ones where there was a deep emotional imperative, a violent reaction from our parents, they are the ones we find very hard to give up. Yep. Nina?
How many lies do we actually create? In the sense that wouldn't most of it have come from beliefs that we've imbibed from the society around us?
No, you can create a lie independently of the lies given to you, and you can also absorb truth independently of the lies given to you. That's what you did with Santa Claus.
Yeah.
There were a whole heap of lies presented to you, and eventually you came to see the truth and you accepted it straight away. You can do that with anything. So the whole idea that because our mum and dad did it, we have to do it, is flawed too.
Mm.
Because the reality is quite different to that. We have a choice to make. Well, each of us have a choice to make. Just because mum and dad chose to do one thing, it doesn't mean that you've chosen the same things. If you think about a lot of your life, Nina, you have not chosen the same things your mum and dad have chosen.
Yeah.
So that proves that you can choose differently. You just prefer not to in certain areas. And the reasons why is because it helps you avoid grief. Make sense?
I have to ponder on it a bit more.
Yeah. I think it's a main thing to ponder on actually about our life. We often want to blame our mum and dad for coming to the conclusions we now come to. But actually, we prefer to come to those conclusions because we've now got into the habit of avoiding our grief.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Now, our mum and dad taught us how to avoid our grief. So that was bad on their part, wasn't it?
Yeah.
To teach us that. But we're now choosing to continue that education,
And that's our creation.
and that's our creation.
Got it. Yeah, okay.
Angela?
So, the holding on to those lies.
Yes.
I don't know. I think
It's purposefully undertaken.
yes,
And what was the purpose?
to avoid the grief.
Yep.
I-
So in your childhood, what happened was, mum and dad told you a whole heap of lies that you felt you had to accept for reasons.
yes.
Most of the which were violent in nature. You know, you'd be punished
Yeah.
if you didn't accept them.
Sure. Yeah.
Is that not true?
Yeah.
So by accepting them, you got to avoid punishment.
Yeah.
So you taught yourself
Yeah.
that by accepting their lies, you got to avoid pain and suffering.
Yeah.
This is a false belief, because you're now in pain and suffering, and you haven't got to avoid anything.
So the pain and suffering is actually a penalty for holding on to it. That's it.
That's right. If you had let the grief happen,
Yeah.
or you could have let the grief happen in your childhood,
Yes.
you now would not be in pain and suffering.
Yes.
But let's say you're an adult and you couldn't, as a child, let yourself have it because your mum and dad might have punished you even further. As an adult, you now have the choice. You can go through that grief now. It's just you could think of it as, and this is how I think of it, it's just a stored group of emotions that I didn't feel when I was a kid. It's all the stuff that mum and dad didn't let me feel
Yeah.
when I was a kid, plus all the stuff I didn't let me feel as I grew up. But by the time I learnt how to use this technique of lies, by the time I learnt how to do it, I was quite young. So I started doing it for myself. I started choosing the same kind of denial form that my mum and dad chose. So I'm now choosing it for myself. So all I've got to do now is feel the grief of my childhood relating to the choice mum and dad made that I accepted, and then feel my choice as an adult to tell myself lies and why I did that, which was all to avoid my grief. The whole lot was done to avoid grief. My parents' grief or my own. And this is why many of you are hooked into not letting your parents cry, not doing anything that will upset your parents. Because as a child, you're still being a child, really. Because the child learnt, don't do anything to upset your parents. And you learnt that if you did something that upset your parents, you had a lot of grief to feel because it would be punished for it, right? So you learnt, don't do that. Tell yourself lies instead. Mum and Dad are nice. Tell myself lies. That manages that set of grief. And then you go, wow, this is a great way of managing grief. Oh, I have a relationship with somebody. Oh, I have some pain to feel because they left me. Oh, I'll use the same technique I've been using all my life that my mum and dad taught me to use. I'll just create a whole heap of lies about that. That was all their fault. They did bad things to me. You know, nothing to do with me. You know, I've just got to find a better man or a better woman. I've just got to find a kinder man or a kinder woman, someone who meets my addiction. I've got to focus on me. I've got to focus on what I want out of life. People have got to love me. You know, all these lies you start telling yourself because they're preferable to you, so you don't have to grieve. No one has to love you. No one. God didn't make a rule where we all have to love each other. He said love is a gift. So there's no rule that anybody has to love you. Of course, there is a rule that if they treat you unkindly, they will be penalised for it. There is that rule. But they don't have to love you. Right? But most of us want to feel people should have to love me.
Especially our parents.
Especially our parents. Yeah. And so we have a substantial amount of grief inside of us that we prefer to cover over with lies. Yeah. Archie?
Feeling that people should have to love us, isn't that a lie to cover over the grief that people didn't love us?
It is.
Yeah.
It is. Eloisa?
We were saying like a lot of the time the lies we tell us ourselves are to avoid the grief because like the more grief we have because of violence that might have happened to us.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking of some of these other griefs like things I suppose I associate with my identity, like being a mum. They're things that I've always had. I've never received violence for. They're like multi-generationals. But is
Yeah,
it
but you have
because
sadness about them, see?
yeah,
Like, how many of you ladies now have sadness about the fact that to be accepted as a woman, you have to be a mum?
yes.
So you do have it.
It's just they're different flavours of sadness or different sort of
Yeah, and there are sadnesses you don't want to feel.
yeah.
So you'd rather choose to be a mum
Right.
than feel the sadness of not being accepted as a woman unless you're a mum.
I see. Like yes.
So you'd rather tell yourself the lie. I have to be a mum.
Because I don't want to.
Because God's not saying you have to be a mum. He's
That's
saying
right.
you've got free will, lady.
Yeah.
Even though you've got a
Right.
womb and a vagina and you can bear a child, you have free will with the way you use it. You don't have to be a mum.
That's right.
Right? You can also be a mum not by giving birth. You can be a mum by, you know, grabbing 5 orphans and being a mum.
That's right.
There's a lot of ways you can be a mum, right? And God's saying, look, it's not about giving birth that makes you a mum. But see, the world is saying that. The world is telling you the lie.
And I believe the lie.
And you believe the lie.
Because I've been indoctrinated from the time I was conceived.
Correct.
That is what it is.
So you believe the lie. And it's the sadness about the lie that you're trying to... The lie is created to avoid the sadness that you didn't have to be a mum.
Yeah, I could have chosen.
You can choose one way or the other.
Yeah.
Makes sense?
Yeah, thank
Tristan?
Wouldn't another lie be that I will be happy being a mum?
Yes. Because how many of you are greatly happy, made extremely happy by being a mum? It was a wonderful experience. Well, in a place of sin, you can see that there's not much happiness doing much at all. Right? And being mum is one of those things, if you do it in sin, that it's not going to be very happy. It's like, that's how it is. It's only going to be happy when you do it without sin.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So yes.
Just thought, can I?
Yep.
This is a principle. It's about finding the real lie, isn't it? So finding the is that like sort of what causes it? Like finding the deepest lie. Or
Yeah, well, usually there's lies connected to lies. You know,
Yes.
like I said, we create a complex labyrinth of lies
Yeah.
in order to avoid some very simple fundamental truths.
Yeah.
Yep. So if you think the average woman, if I tell the average woman when they're 70, after they've had 5 kids and 15 grandkids, that they didn't have to have children at all in order to be validated as a woman by God, the average woman's going to be pretty upset at hearing that, right?
Yeah.
Because they've only felt validation as a woman by having those children and having those grandchildren.
Yeah.
That's the only way they've received any validation. No male has given them any validation on the planet unless they were a mum. You think about it now. Just being a mum, what do people say? They say,
Well, you get a whole lot of accolades, or you get like a lot of things through the children.
who's the
or
person you should never have an argument with?
Your mum.
Who's the person who you should never disagree with?
Your mum. That's what
Who's the person who brought you into the
your
world
mum.
and is allowed to tell you, and is allowed to tell you anything they want
Your
you to tell you,
mum.
and you should do it?
Your
Your
mum.
Okay,
Your mum.
so you take away all that,
Yeah.
isn't there a fair bit of grief?
Yeah, and the lady at the post office said to me, she said, because I was saying, she asked how I was, I said, I'm having some issues with being a mum, and she was like, you'll never stop being a mum. And I was like, fuck, do not fucking be a mum. I didn't actually say
Well,
that to her.
it is a physical truth that once you've been a mum,
Yeah,
you can never
right.
stop being a mum. But
Emotional,
because you are one. Yeah. But the whole thing of what that entails, you think of how addicted women on the planet are to perceiving that that's their role. And why are they addicted to it? Because they have, in history, been very rarely given any other valid role.
And now there's more lies and more fears about breaking out of that, because who are you in the world to like be like what God's created? Your personality, nature, your passions, your desires.
That's right. Many mums have sacrificed all of those things to be a mum.
Yeah.
They've sacrificed every desire they've ever had.
Yeah.
They've lived a life of slavery. Literally.
Yeah.
Like for the men around them generally, but also for their children. They've lived a life of slavery. They've become the slave of their family. And how much grief is there in that? So you've got to lie to yourself about how important being a mum is, so you can avoid all the pain and suffering of you being slaves for most of your lives. Do you understand?
Yeah.
There's a huge amount of grief in you about being a slave for most of your life. And so you've got to stay addicted to this concept that it was all worth it because it meant you were a mum. No, it wasn't.
That's another lie.
There's no good reason for being a slave for all of your life. None. Whether it's incarceration or belief of a society that says being a mum is everything. Both of them are traps. They're prisons. And they're not much different in the emotions you feel as a result of them. So stop going, oh, being a mum is everything, when the reality is, no, you're very traumatised by being a mum in many cases, right? You've been indoctrinated into a life of slavery by believing being a mum is the thing you need to be, right? There's a huge amount of grief in you about this. Now, I know you have the blessings and benefits of having children, right? And there are blessings and benefits to having children, and I'm not denying those blessings and benefits. But I am saying, for the majority of you, it was forced upon you without any other options being given to you by both your partners and your family and your parents, and you've been indoctrinated into a role that suppressed almost every other desire you ever had. Sexual, emotional, intellectual, physical and spiritual. How can you not have a whole heap of grief about it? And a great way of avoiding that grief is just tell yourself being your mum was the most important thing in your life.
It's the only thing.
It is not the most important thing in your life. God does not think it is the most important thing in your life. Otherwise, God would have just built you for that only role and had given you no intellect and no anything else in order to do anything else. If he thought that was the most important thing and the only thing of importance, he wouldn't have given you the ability to even... He would have made you a slave instead of a free will person. That's what he would have done. And he didn't do that. Humans did. There's going to be grief, right? about it. And you can see the intensity of the lie Oh, being a mum is so important. You have to be a mum. If you've got a vagina, you have to be a mum. You know, that's the underlying thing. And the reason why that becomes so important for society, men and women, to say it to you, because it helps you avoid a whole ton of grief about this problem,
Yeah.
which is a human problem, a false belief that God doesn't accept as true.
For me, I don't even feel like it's about being a mum. It's about being a girl. To be a girl, you're a slave.
That's right. That's right. And this whole mum thing is about becoming a slave. Being a mum is all about being a slave as a girl in many cases.
And getting something back. You know, finally.
Well, the reward is everybody now idolises you being a mum. But that's the lie.
Yeah.
You see, you need that lie to avoid all the grief. You need that lie. Because if you don't tell yourself that lie, what's left is grief. You know? And this is the reason why we choose the lies, because what's left over when we don't tell ourselves the lie is the grief of the untruth, of what the untruth created, right? Now, we could pick any subject that you are afraid of and turn it into a grief you're avoiding. That's the reality. Make sense? Yeah. Everything you're afraid of, everything you're angry about, every addiction you have are all the result of grief in specific areas that you're avoiding. Every one of them. Or you could say they are the results of lies you tell yourself to avoid the grief. Yeah? False things you tell yourself to avoid the grief. And we're very intent on doing it, and society is very intent on enabling you doing it. Because society as a whole has a huge amount of grief. And nobody on earth basically wants to cry about it. Nobody. How many people do you meet in the course of the day who would like to have a cry during the day? Hardly anybody, right? So society is still educating you that lies are your best course of action. Sandra?
To truly feel the grief, do you have to see it as a lie?
Yep.
Yeah.
Not your grief is the lie. Your grief is the truth. It's the lies you tell yourself are the fears.
Right.
Right? Your grief is the truth of what happened.
Okay. But if you're feeling like
So can I give you an
this is
example?
the truth.
Well, I'll give you an example with the earlier thing we said about women.
Mm.
The truth is, you women have been treated like slaves. You women have been sold an illusion that being a mother is the most important thing to do in your life. It's an illusion. You've been sold it by society, and you've been sold it by your parents, and you've believed it. That's the lie. And the lie, in that being sold to you, you denied your character, your nature, your personality, your desires, your passions in almost every other area of your life. That's the grief. The grief is you've been sold something that was meant to compensate for all these other things not being met. And it didn't. It's never going to, because all these other things should be met. Right? So you were sold the lie, and by staying believing this lie, it helps you avoid the immense amount of grief you have about having been a slave who suppressed their feelings and emotions, and who suppressed their life, and who wasn't able to live a life without having children, and who wasn't able to live without their children, and wasn't able to have their own passions and desires. You've been sold this lie, and this lie helps you avoid the grief about all those things. The lie is, being a mother is the most important thing a woman can do. That's the lie.
So when a woman feels that, as what you just said, that last sentence,
Yep.
I am a slave, this is my... That's not feeling the truth about it, is it? It's feeling the
No, that
lie.
is feeling the truth
That is feeling the truth. Oh, good.
of her life.
Yeah.
That's feeling the truth of her life.
Okay.
She has been,
Yeah.
for the most part. You think about it, all of you who are married, you think about it, the majority of you still are slaves to either your children or your husband or both. Right?
But then even the ones, like, for example, I was just thinking about Rani and I, where we don't have children and we don't have husbands, I
And
still
what are you
feel like
told?
we have the same feelings inside of us that we're just not...
Well, what are you told? You're told the lie
Yeah,
that unless you have a child, Sandy,
yeah,
you're really not a valid woman yet.
yeah, that's true.
And anything else you do won't be as important as having a child. And what absolute utter crap. It's not, everything else you do is, many of the things can be far more important than having a child is. Right? Having a child is easy, you just have sex with somebody. And unprotected sex with somebody, you have a child. But how is that more important than living a life of principle, or living a life where you're helping other people, or living a life in truth with a lot of other things, or creating a whole heap of loving structures in the rest of your life? How is having a child more important than that? It's not more important. It's just an experience. It's not more important. And this lie you've been sold, sacrifice yourself, sacrifice your personality, sacrifice your nature, sacrifice all the other desires for the sake of this child, right? This is the lie. And while you believe that lie, you'll avoid the emotion. Yeah? Alan?
And the other part of that equation is there are standards about what a mother should be and do. And,
Yep.
you know, like, I feel like I sacrificed my children sometimes for my desires, and
Correct.
that's really bad.
Yeah.
You're a bad mother.
Yeah. Yeah. And the reality is there such a thing as if you have desires, are you sacrificing anybody else for them? See, if your desires are loving, is it possible to sacrifice them for somebody else? If your desires are loving, isn't it going to result in a good thing for your children if you follow them? Right? So the only thing that's worth sacrificing in the sake of if anything's worth sacrificing is your unloving desires, not your good ones. Your good ones, your loving ones, are going to help your children. They're not going to hinder them. So sacrificing loving desires as an effort to love your children, you're not loving your children or yourself. Right? But these are all false things you were told. False bill of sale, if you like. A false invoice. You said, if you do these things, you'll get this result. And you haven't got the result you were promised. And also for many of you, you have yet, some of you are now in your 60s and 70s, and you still don't know what your passions are. Isn't that true? That you still don't really know your nature or your personality. Why is that? Because you've had a life where you've had to sacrifice your nature and your personality over and over and over and over again for the sake of this particular bill of sale, which is being a mother is the most important thing in your life. Right? You're going to have sadness about this. But to avoid the sadness, tell yourself that being a mother is the most important thing in your life. That's a great way of avoiding the sadness, you see.
And then we invest in our kids in this horrible way.
Of course.
It's just like...
Well, the natural result of a lie is fear, which creates addictions. So you're going to end up with addictions with your children. For sure. How can you not? You've been told that being a mother is the most important thing in your life. So if you're a bad mother and something happens with your children and things go bad with your children, what does that mean about you now? You've been told that if your children are unsuccessful, that's your fault. If you've been told if your children turn out bad, that's your fault too. If you're told if your children make bad decisions, that's your fault. If you're told if your children have a hard life, that's your fault too. You've been told all of these things. So of course you're going to overinvest in your children, because you go, if I don't overinvest in my child, it will work out that I'll look bad.
But then they end up a certain way, and you can sort of see everything anyway.
Correct. Well, the natural result of us obtaining an addiction is going to be more pain and suffering, is going to be more sin on the part of our children as well as ourselves. So that is going to be the natural result. And we can't avoid that natural result. That's the law of compensation saying, what you're doing is wrong. Your fundamental lie that being a mother is everything is wrong. Right? And it's done to avoid your own emotions. So when you avoid your own emotions, you're going to have addictions. You're going to do more wrong things. The natural result is you're going to do more wrong things. So you can see underneath all of that, you can see the purpose of telling yourself being a mum is the most important thing in your life that you've ever done, right, is really to avoid a whole heap of pain and suffering about what it's been like to be a slave to a bunch of people who really don't appreciate it. They say they do, but they still treat you like crap, and they still get you to do their washing and their ironing and their clean up, and they still get you to, run around after them wherever they can, and they still project at you unloving things all the time, even though they've now got their own lives. So, isn't the bill of sale, the thing you were told obviously is false. Yeah. And then, of course, there's all the feelings you have about, I had to deny, my passions in life in order to be this. I had to deny what I wanted to do for my life as well. And you didn't have to, but you were told you had to. Right? So that's an example of the lies being created to help you avoid the truth of the grief. Yeah. And of course your mothers had already done that by the time you arrived, because they were told the same thing. And so they educated you to do the same thing. Now you are adults now, and you can face the facts. Let's face the fact. Being a mother isn't the most important thing you're going to ever do in your life. It really isn't. There's going to be lots of other things you do that are going to be just as important. And some of them may be more important. Right? Relationship with soulmate, more important. Relationship with God, more important. Your relationship with the principles of truth and those principles of faith, love, humility, more important. They're all more important than having children. Yeah. And you eventually come to terms with that and you go, wow, many of you have lived a life on earth living to one ideal while sacrificing the majority of your existence for it. Right? And then you wonder, why do I feel so unfulfilled? Why do I feel so like it was all a waste? That's why, because you sacrificed yourself for the lie, you see. And you weren't told that at the beginning of your life, and you weren't told that when you were 20 when you started having kids, or 25 when you started having kids. You weren't told any of these things by anybody, because nobody is willing to say the truth about mothers, because no mother wants to hear it, because no mother wants to feel a grief about it. You understand? And no father wants to hear it, because no father wants to hear that he's been a bastard in the way he's treated his wife. Right? So none of them want to hear it. Nobody in the world wants to hear it. So that's why you don't hear very many people on earth saying it.
So when we fully feel that our children will be free of us.
Yeah. Not only that, though, that you'll be free of the concept that your whole purpose in life was to have children. It's interesting that men are not told this. A man's still a valid man if he doesn't have children. So why are you told this? You can see how unfair it is. It's very unfair. But this is the trouble with the lie that it's so important. It helps you avoid how unfair it is, how unjust it was, how bad it was for your life, how bad it was for your children actually. Because most of your children grew up believing that they're better than you, that they are more important than you are. Because you were taught as a mother to make them believe that, right? So most of them have been disadvantaged by that now. Their soul is disadvantaged by that belief. But these are the things, once you realise all that, you go, what a terrible disaster, really. that all women on the planet have sold this idea from the prior generation of men and women. Men sell it because they want to control you. Women sell it because they are so upset about their own lives and they don't want to feel the pain of it. They'd rather have you have the pain of it as well. Pretty sad. Your mothers would rather you believe that so they can continue believing it, so they can avoid their grief, rather than acknowledge the truth. So that's an example of a so-called truth on the earth, being a mother is everything, which is actually a fear, a lie being told that creates huge amounts of fear in you and motivated lots of your actions through the rest of your life. And it was all done to avoid this underlying, this immense amount of quite complex grief relating to who you are, your personality, your nature, your desires and your passions, your sexuality, your spirituality, all denied, all put down, all relegated to this one fundamental false belief. Yep. And all done because somebody before you wanted to avoid their grief. Yep. So you can, like I said earlier, you can choose any aspect of your life, male or female, you can choose any aspect of your life, and you will always see that whenever you have been in a state of fear, it is a purposeful decision, either by your lineage or by you, to avoid grief. It's a lie that is being told to avoid grief. God's love, when it comes to you, will expose every lie. Eventually you'll go, that's a lie, that's a lie, that's a lie, that's a lie. And then every lie that is exposed to you, you will have grief attached to it. Attached to the lie. Because the lie is in you emotionally, it has to come out. So you deny the grief, you're going to shut down the process of receiving God's love. You deny the grief, you'll also, in the end, have to tell yourself lies to do it. That's how you deny grief, by telling yourself lies. That's how you make the grief go away, without feeling it. See, and by the way, it doesn't go away. It just gets stored.
And it seems to me it gets harder to deny. You realise that you're in such a, it feels like you're in between a rock and a hard place because you don't want to, your addictions and that don't feel as good as they did.
Yes.
But you don't want to grieve.
That's right.
But you do want your relationship with God.
That's
you don't
right.
want to grieve to get it.
That's right.
So you're like...
That's right. So now you're in a state where you don't want to do one thing, you want to do one thing, but you can't do the thing that makes that thing happen. You don't want to do the other thing, you don't want to sin, but you have to sin in order to keep the lie, and so you end up in this state where nothing really happens and nothing really changes, right?
Yeah, and I just get angry.
You just get angry, frustrated, upset, and this is what happens to many who hear divine truth on earth. Is they get so upset about these things they just don't want to hear any more truth. Make sense?
Yeah.
Because the truth is the antidote to the fears that are there so that you can avoid grief. If you accept truth, you'll have to process grief. Have to. And every single one of us on earth who's ever lived on earth, in the spirit world, has to go through this process. In the spirit world, we called it expiation. But that was just a label given to the process of having to come face to face with the reality of your grief and feeling it. Phoebe?
It seems sometimes, like when I've felt grief, that there's always a flavour of repentance with it.
Yep.
Is that because it seems like there's so much lies, sin bound up in the holding on to the grief?
Yep.
So is it fair to say that while we have sin, true grief is going to be sort of hand in hand with repentance?
Yep.
To some extent.
And you'll also feel the fear of your lies in the process of grieving. You'll feel the fear of giving up your lies. So one of the things you'll go through is the fears of giving up your lies. Because in the process of giving up your lies, you're going to feel grief, right? And you're afraid of your grief. So the real fear you have is not all these little intricate fears that you believe you have. The real fear you have is feeling your grief. Right? And so every time you feel grief, you'll probably also have some fear to feel. Make sense? Because it's all just you're terrified of feeling grief. So...
And there's just so much sin that we've engaged in the avoidance of that.
All of our sin.
All of our sin.
All of our sin.
Yeah.
Every piece of sin we've ever created in our entire life has been the result of us avoiding our grief. Yeah. Now, it's probably not right to say all, because there is the sins that we create, like I'm on a man, that we've chosen to create. The lie, we've chosen to create a lie. So there are those kind of things which are also we're going to have to grieve about. Yeah. But every time we choose to create a lie, whether it's a lie about our past or a lie about our intentions for our future, there will be grief associated that we're going to have to feel. And every time we create the lie, we create fears. Every time we create fears, we create addictions and so forth. Make sense? Now, you could say that there's two ways of sinning. One way is to avoid the lies of the past, and another way is to create lies for your future. Couldn't you? Avoiding the lies of the past is all... You're choosing to avoid the lies of your past by creating, or your parents have done, by creating a series of lies to avoid the grief. So you're choosing to avoid the grief of the past by creating a set of lies about your past. Or you're choosing to create lies about your future. And one way you do that is by going, if I do this particular sinful thing, I'll be happy. That's a lie about your future. There's going to be fear associated with it. And then there's going to be addictions and everything being created as a result of it. You could say that relates to the pleasure-pain system. The pain being the pain of your past. So the grief is, well, the pain of your past. And the lies you tell yourself are that that pain can be avoided. And you could say the pleasure system is, I tell myself a bunch of lies that these things will bring me pleasure. Which means I will in the future have to feel some grief about those things. Because they're lies. They won't bring me pleasure. Right? So it all relates to the things I've taught you already, right?
Yeah.
Just in different ways. It's just fundamentally, the lie is required to avoid your grief. And it can be a lie about your past, or it can be a lie about your future. But it will cause you to avoid grief about it in the end. Yeah? And every lie you tell yourself, whether it's about your past or about your future, is a sin. So, given the fact that you're telling yourself lies to avoid humility, you can see avoiding humility is a sin. Right?
Just have a question with terror, how that relates to the grief.
You're terrified of your grief. Why do you want to be terrified of your grief? You want to be terrified of your grief. What does terror say?
It's too big.
It's too big. By feeling something's too big, what do you get to do? Not do it, not feel it. Archie?
By saying it's too big sort of makes me feel like it's a valid excuse for avoiding it. Well, if I said something, I was like, I just don't want to feel it.
That'd be more accurate.
Yeah, but I don't really feel like that's a valid excuse.
Correct.
So therefore, I relabel it, say it differently, so I see it as valid.
That's right. Exactly right. You see, if you tell yourself you're terrified or you're afraid, most people go, oh, then you shouldn't have to do it. But if you tell yourself, I just damn well don't want to do it, then people go, you're not a very nice person. You can just be on the same matter. And yet you tell yourself that you're fear and afraid and everything, they go, okay. But if you tell yourself I don't want to, they go, you're a bit of a nasty person, you know.
You don't understand.
So you can see that even by telling yourself that you're afraid or terrified, it's more societally accepted for you to do that than just say to yourself, I don't want to be loving. Because fundamentally that's what we're saying. When we tell ourselves a lie, we're telling ourselves, I don't want to feel I won't want to be humble. Humble is loving. When you feel your own emotions without dumping them on other people, that's loving to them. You're feeling your own pain rather than giving them pain. That's loving. Right? So basically we're saying, I don't want to be loving. Right? This is why God doesn't feel fear is very valid or terror is very valid. Because he knows that we're basically saying, I just don't want to be loving. But see, on earth, if you said, I just don't want to be loving, everyone would go, oh, you terrible person, that's really, really bad. But if you say, I'm really afraid, they go, oh, you poor thing, you shouldn't have to feel that. But basically you're saying the same thing.
Yeah.
But one thing is acceptable by society, and so you get away with it. The other thing's not acceptable, and you wouldn't get away with it, so you don't tell yourself that thing. If you think about it, inside of yourself, it's the same. Many of you feel, if you're terrified or you're afraid, then you shouldn't have to do it. But if you tell yourself, I don't want to do it, then you feel more guilty, right? Yeah. So that's why you tell yourself you're afraid, and you tell yourself you're terrified. And when I say tell yourself, this is an emotional process. Your grief is emotional. Your lies you tell yourself are emotional to avoid your grief. And the fear that results is emotional. So this is why you believe it, because it's emotional. You do feel it as a fear. You feel it as an emotion, right? But it's actually a lie, because the emotion exists because you're afraid of your not wanting to feel your grief. And so the emotion of fear exists because you're afraid of your grief. Right? So fundamentally all of our fears are, or all of our terrors are, about our grief. Yeah. Paul?
So that's the best place to go if we're feeling afraid, is to see the bottom line of it, that I'm afraid to feel my grief, to feel the pain.
No, that's not a truth. I didn't say that.
Or that I don't want to.
I don't want to feel my grief. Yep. And I have to create a lie in order to avoid it, to distance myself from it.
Yeah.
So to reverse it, you need to start telling yourself the truth about your grief. I am actually quite sad, like in the previous example I gave about women, I am quite sad that I've been sold this crap about being a mother. I am quite sad about what it did to my life. I'm quite sad about the fact that it's not true. You know, I was told all these things, but none of them have come about. Or very few of them have come about. I was told it all, and it didn't happen. Do you see what I'm saying? So you have to, and I've said this a number of times in the discussion, Paul, you have to start with the fact that the fear is a feeling you have because you want the lie. Yeah. want it. You want the lie to be true. The lie about your grief. You want to lie about it to yourself, so you don't have to feel it.
And even sort of saying I'm afraid of my grief is playing the same game, sort of.
It is. Yeah.
It's
And in the end, you will feel how afraid of your grief you are, but it's not a truth because your fear has been created by the lie. You're afraid of the truth, actually. You're not afraid of your grief, you're afraid of the truth, because the truth will cause you to feel grief. Do you understand? Yeah. So what we're afraid of frequently is the truth. We're not afraid of emotion as much as we are afraid of truth, because the truth will make us feel emotion, right? The truth will set you free of all of your sin, all of your emotion, that's pain and suffering. Yeah? Hutch?
When you just said afraid of a truth because it will cause me to feel my grief, is that the same reason why, like in my case, I do not want feedback? Because I know the feedback is a truth that will make me feel my grief.
Make you cry.
Yeah.
It's going to make you cry. Anything that confronts the error within is going to make you cry. The error, the only way it can come out is by you crying, actually.
And
that's the interesting thing, and I need to probably say that again, right? The error can only come out by you having a cry. It's the only way it can exit you. There's no other way it can exit you. Right? So you can see the error itself can only go if you cry. And so you can see, well, if that's the case, then crying is an important part of this process, isn't it? Yeah. And I have to accept it is. Yeah. And this is why many people on earth will tell you, what AJ is fundamentally teaching is that you've got to have to cry for the rest of your life.
It feels like.
And all of those divine truth people are all just morose all the time. Now, I don't appear morose to you all the time, do I? So I'm suggesting that when you release your grief, you'll be less morose. Yeah? It's only when you stay in your terrors and your fears, which are staying in your lies, that you get morose. On this path, the only way you can stay morose is by continuing to believe your lies. Alan?
In your journey now, is it just grief that you feel?
No, I have... honestly, if I had allowed all of my lies, if I accepted all the truth about my lies, would I have any grief left? I wouldn't, would I? No. So obviously I must still have some lies in myself that I've got to release. Make sense? Yeah. And I do. Yep. Just not sort of the standard ones. You know what I mean? They'll be just different ones. That's all. Not the standard ones you guys have. Because I haven't had the life. I've got rid of a lot of those lies. I'm now dealing with lies that are much harder to deal with, in the sense because they are related specifically to myself and can't be triggered easily by me just having a life on earth. I have to actually ponder about them and think about them and feel about them purposefully in order to deal with them. Right? Nothing on earth is going to trigger them. Yeah. For the most part, Yeah. But there's still lies that cause my suffering, it caused me to feel pain, and I still have to cry. If I cry, they go. Yeah. So I just got to tell myself the truth. But of course, no one around me wants to accept any of the truths I've got to tell myself. That makes sense? So I've got to go through it. But the advantage for you is that you've at least got one person telling you a truth. right? Like just earlier, I told all the women in the group the truth about being a mother. At least you got one person in your life saying it. Makes sense? That can help, right? Yeah. And you imagine, once you go through that lie, get to the actual feeling, process the feeling, you're going to be pretty dedicated about speaking up about that with every woman you meet, aren't you? Like, why wouldn't you be? Like, it's like an enlightening thing about being a woman is you don't have to be a mother, and also don't neglect all of the other things you could do, following your desires and passions, and not being a slave to the people around you. You know, these are all very important things that every woman on the planet surely would benefit from, wouldn't they? Aren't they?
Yes.
So can you see, once you release your own, once you no longer believe the lie and you release the pain that's under that the lie covers, you can see, once that occurs, you'll be going, oh, this is a wonderful truth. I've got to tell everybody. Wouldn't you?
Yep.
Yeah. And the only reason why you're not telling everybody at this stage is because you don't think it's a wonderful truth, because there's feelings you have and you don't feel they're very wonderful. Yeah. But once you release them, you'll be fine. Yeah. The psychology of the human soul. What a wonderful thing, isn't it? So, Arch?
It'd be pretty amazing if like all psychologists like taught about the psychology of the human soul. And
well, this is something you can be taught when you're 5.
Yeah.
It's something you can easily learn at school. It's something that should be taught at school, actually. That every fear you have is actually created from the desire to avoid grief. And if every teacher understood this with all their students, can you imagine how easy the students would be able to cry when they're in class?
Yeah.
They'd just be able to have their emotions while they're in class, and they'd learn a lot faster as a result. So you imagine you're taught these things as a young child, you're not going to store all the things that the average adult stores through the course of their life.
Yeah.
They're just going to, whenever they have something to cry about, they just have a cry. Now it's gone, now they can move forward, and that thing is not going to affect them anymore. So yeah, these kind of things should be taught to children, not to just to adults or psychologists or anything like that. Yeah. Well, what do you reckon? Yeah, so you can see the dynamic of when God's love stops. It's basically because of the grief you're unwilling to feel. And all the fears you have are all the lies you want to tell yourself about the grief you're unwilling to feel. They're all purposefully created by others or by you in order to avoid the grief of the lies of your past or the lies about your future.
Or both.
Or both.
More likely both.
Yeah, well, always both. Yep, always both. So once you have released the lies of your past, the only lies you'll be willing to tell yourself now will be lies about your future. But you'll be less inclined to do so now that you've learnt the lesson of the lies about your past. Just
wouldn't you also be less inclined if you're if you're receiving love from God? Like, if God's going to tell you what your future is, you can just trust that instead of coming up with new lies.
That's right, and also you'd be a lot less desirous of the lie as well, wouldn't you? Because the love state means you'll be less desirous of the lie. Because the love state says feeling your stuff is good. And when you're in that state where you feel like feeling your stuff is good, you do feel that it is good. You don't feel, and you don't feel like that it's terrible to do it. You don't feel like it's really going to be a bad result. You feel like it's going to be a good result. You know.
So for a mon and a man,
Yep.
so when they're in the perfect natural man state,
Yep.
the only lies you can create is about their future, and
Correct.
that's what they did.
That's what they did. That's what they did.
But that's because, or is that mainly because they didn't have God's love in their heart? Like what Tracy just said, if you had it, you're probably more inclined not to.
That's right. They didn't have God's love in their heart.
Yeah.
But also, they were refusing the truth. They wanted the lie.
Yes.
Remember, they desired the lie. So it required them to develop a desire for the lie. The lie being they would be gods in their own right. So they wanted that lie to be true, and they desired it with their emotions. That's what made it a lie, by desiring it with their feelings. Make sense?
So we can still do the same thing even when we receive God's love. We can still then desire something.
Of course you can.
In the future.
Yeah, but it's hard.
Yeah.
Because you're going to feel the opposition between the love that's in you and the lie you're trying to tell yourself. Yeah. You follow? Yeah. So it is harder. And this is the beauty of receiving God's love too. It makes it harder for you to sin.
That's good.
It's cool. Yeah, it makes it harder for you to tell yourself a lie. You know, you feel bad when you tell yourself lies. Make sense? Yeah. Yeah. Now, there's a lot we could say about the dynamics of it all and how it all works and what actually goes on energetically and all that stuff, but really fundamentally what we've covered with regard to the reason why we shut down the process of receiving love is true. Remember though, for our previous discussion, we might not be asking for love because we don't even believe in God. We might not be asking for love because we don't believe God's good. We might not be asking for love because we don't believe that love is good. And these things also would need to be addressed. They're lies we tell ourselves, and the net result is they cover feelings we don't want to feel. So when you tell yourself that, you know, God's an unloving being or God doesn't exist, even the idea that God doesn't exist is a lie, and therefore it's a lie about your future. Therefore it's going to create pain and suffering. Does that make sense? Because it's a lie about your future, and it's a lie about the reality, right? So even telling yourself a lie that God doesn't exist has to be somehow dealt with emotionally before you're going to ask for God's love. So this is what we talked about last week, really, where we talked about the feelings we have about whether God really does exist, about whether God really is a nice person, about whether God really wants to give us any love. These lies that we've told ourselves cause us to not engage the process, to not have a feeling that we want it. So these things also must be considered. So I'm not saying to skip over what we've spoken about last week. They all of these things sum total together, don't they? Yeah. In order to allow you to continue receiving God's love. Today we've discussed the issue with regard to acting in harmony with love is a choice between acting in, to work out what natural love is, or receiving some love from God. And in the process of receiving love from God, the reason why we have a tendency to grieve is because it exposes the lies and therefore exposes the grief under the lies. The grief, you could say, the lies of cause, right, is exposed, and we have to feel it. Yeah. What?
If we're willing to feel the grief, like what you just said, and I've asked this question before, if we're willing to feel the grief and we long for God's love, then we will be sincere in our prayer and we'll receive the love.
That's right.
We don't have to release the grief, but we want to.
When you say you don't have to release the grief, the releasing of the grief will be a natural part of receiving the love if you want to continue receiving it.
Yeah, but I'd want to, when I'm praying, I'd want to feel about the thing.
Well, now you're trying to make a whole set of rules instead of just listening to the principle. The principle is every time you lie to yourself, you are creating fears. The purpose of the lie is to avoid your grief. If you are lying to yourself, you can't sincerely pray and expect to receive love. You follow? Because it's not sincere. You've got to be sincere. Now, in being sincere, as you receive love, grief will be exposed. And the lies will be exposed, and you'll be able to feel them. That's a natural process. What you're trying to do now is because you've got fear about your grief. You understand?
Yeah, I want to dive in.
You want to avoid your grief still, and that now you're asking questions in order to try to avoid your grief still. And I go, well, no, I've already told you can't avoid your grief. You're going to have your grief. You're not going to be able to avoid it in using any method. Now, you can say you're willing to feel your grief, but if you're not feeling it right now, you're not willing. Isn't that true? Mm-hmm. If you have grief in you now, and you're not feeling it now, then it means you're unwilling.
I've got a massive headache.
Yeah. So you need to be willing. And the trick is to become willing to feel your grief. Yeah. And isn't that something we can all pray about? Being more willing, learning how to... Like, the only reason why you're unwilling to feel grief is because of the lies you tell yourself about grief. The principle of feeling grief is the same as your principle of feeling any other thing associated with grief with any other thing. And that is, so your worries about feeling emotion are really the same as your worries about any other thing. And that is, they're all created as lies, so you don't have to feel them. So the worry you have about your emotion is just your fears being dominant, the lies being dominant about your emotion. So what, we've raised this with you many, many times. What are your beliefs about feeling emotion? Be honest about them. Stop lying to yourself about them. You feel it's crazy to feel emotion. You feel it's unacceptable. You feel you're not going to be able to cope. You feel it's going to be terrible. You feel these are feelings that you're telling yourself about emotion. So feel those truths rather than tell yourself lies. That makes sense? The very first truth that is important for you to feel is really the truth about emotion. You understand? Yep. And it's the lies you tell yourself about emotion that stop you feeling every other thing. Do you follow what I'm saying? Yeah. If you've got a global blockage to feeling emotion, any kind of emotion, can you see you must be telling yourself lies about emotion? So when you say, I've got to feel emotion, you're telling yourself a lie about emotion. You don't got to feel it. God gives you the freedom to feel it or not. When you tell yourself these things, you're telling yourself lies about emotion. The net effect is you won't feel emotion. Now I'm saying you have to feel emotion in order to progress. Dominantly, a lot of the emotion is going to be grief, is an emotion. To feel the grief, you've got to have to stop telling yourself lies about it. You can handle it. It's going to be okay. It's going to end up good. Not bad. You understand? At the moment, Mom, you want to keep telling yourself that emotion is bad. Emotion is bad. Emotion is bad. It's a lie. Stop telling yourself the lie. And you'll start feeling emotion. Make sense? And it'll be real. Okay. And the fact that you got a headache, by the way, Mum, means...
I'm avoiding my grief.
That's right. You don't want to feel emotion.
Yeah.
So be honest, That's where you need to start. I don't want to feel it. That's the truth. That's the truth you can tell yourself. But it'd be more important to ask you why, and that's a lot about false beliefs you have about emotion. You think it's bad, you think it is... In fact, you think you're weak if you feel it, you think you're not being powerful if you feel it. You think other people are going to control you if you feel it. And you've got a lot of false beliefs about emotion. The reality is, more and more, you find that the more you feel emotion, the less control people have over you, not more. Right? More control you have over your life, not less. You know, there's a whole heap of things that are untrue just about emotion. But again, it's the same principle. The principle is you lie to yourself so you don't have to feel. Yep. And I can feel that some of you don't get it still, that's okay, but we need to start at this point where you begin to even intellectually grasp that the reason why things are not working is because you're choosing to not feel some things. And the fear is just lies that you tell yourself to not feel.
No, I don't get it. Like I'm saying, I get it, but I don't.
No, you don't get it. So
I don't get it.
you need to meditate it about what I've just said and pray about it.
Yeah, really.
Yeah, you don't want to get it, so you need to meditate it and pray about it and ask yourself whether you ever want to get it. You're capable of getting it. Yeah. Everybody on earth, a child is capable of understanding this. So you're capable of understanding it. If you don't want to understand it, then it's because you don't want to. So start there. Be honest. I don't want to. You're allowed to not want to. God's given you free will. You're allowed to choose to not want to do something. Okay. How's that for everyone? Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
So, what we want to do is focus on. My suggestion to you is focus on receiving the love. But if you don't want to feel your feelings, you're not going to receive any. And you need to deal with why you don't want to feel your feelings, whatever that reason is. Stop telling yourself lies about your feelings. You can handle them, they're fine, you're not going to die from it. You're not going to become a psychotically unstable person feeling your feelings. In fact, the way you become psychologically unstable is by not feeling them. The way you die is by not feeling them. Good day.